We are live on the show, everyone. Welcome. This is another episode of Coin Watch, where Paul Puey, the CEO of Edge Wallet, and myself dive into a different coin every week. We talk about the history, we talk about the roadmap, we talk about the team, we talk about what we like and what we don't like, and a very candid discussion from two people who've been in the industry for a very long time. But Paul Puey, in particular, has a very unique vantage point for looking at the crypto space. As the CEO of Edge Wallet, he has to deal with a lot of different cryptocurrencies, which makes his insight incredibly valuable. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks. Glad to be here and glad to talk about yet another asset, an OG one in that respect. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, OG DeFi. Let's do it.
Yeah, today we're doing Maker and we're doing DAI. So DAI was the first ever stablecoin that was decentralized and collateralized. So the idea is it's pegged by putting collateral and holding that collateral. So we'll talk about like how the intricacies of all of that work. As always, if you have questions for the show, head over to cointree.app/Naomi Brockwell. I'll post that link in the description. But Paul, do you want to start us off and just give us an overview of what Maker and DAI are?
Cool. So Maker, when I say the OG, I mean this is the OG of DeFi. Before people even came up with the term DeFi, Maker was being ideated. So this starts as far back as 2014. CEO and founder Rune Christensen had started writing the concept of what Maker would be, and it actually originally launched in 2015, but just the Maker token itself. Not until, I believe, 2017 did the actual ecosystem of Maker DAO and DAI really come into place. And what it in essence is a lending network and a stable coin. So it's a lending network allowing people to borrow a stable coin or borrow dollars or an equivalent of dollars, but collateralizing that loan with ETH, at least originally ETH when it was just a single collateral system. Now it is a multi-collateral system at this point in time, but that's inherently all it is. It's, hey, I want to use some of my ETH as collateral to borrow some dollars. Out comes this coin, which is now pegged to the dollar that can be used for a whole slew of other things in this DeFi ecosystem. But at its heart, that's what it is. It's lending as well, or not lending, but borrowing as well as a stable coin.
Yeah, and we'll talk about all the incentive structures, which I think are super interesting. And then maybe we'll go into governance, talking about Maker in particular. But it's really hard to have a discussion of one without the other because they are intrinsically linked there. So before we dive into that incentive structure, I do want to read out, I got a CoinTree message about you, Paul. You ready for this one? This is from Anonymous. I'm not sure who sent this one. They said, as your next show is on DeFi, my favorite topic, forgive me, but just one more question for Paul. When Edge DApp browsing, brah, does Paul have CoinTree? I'd love to berate him about that directly. Do you have a CoinTree, Paul?
I don't have a CoinTree, but
how are people meant to tip you to show appreciation?
How are they going to berate me? Then sure, I will open one by the time we have another Coin Watch episode, so you can berate me about DApp browser, brah. So to answer your question, DApp browsers are not allowed on iOS for one thing, and we're entirely mobile. And fundamentally, I'll write a blog about this. I actually really think that dApps, especially DeFi specifically, should be baked into the wallet, as opposed to having a DApp browser where you have two different apps that you have to run. And that's the thing that we're looking at doing inside of Edge. So be able to take out a loan, fund a loan, do leverage trading, all from within the actual app that's holding your keys. And we can do a whole episode on some of the pros and cons of the current ecosystem, but I think that's the direction that many apps are going to go.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that in iOS, you're not allowed to have a DApp browser. Like they have a lot of rules that try to clamp down on crypto and all kinds of things. But anyway, let's go back into DAI. Let's talk about the incentive structure. So we're talking about a peg with the dollar, and this has to be maintained somehow. Usually in the real world, when you had like the British pound, for example, pegged, you have a certain amount in reserve assets that people, use to buy the dollar. You have people actually putting money in to adjust that. How does this work when it's decentralized? Explain all these incentives.
Yeah, this is an amazing way of stabilizing in a way, it's a free floating coin. It really can go up and down relative to the dollar, but it just has motivation to keep it at roughly $1. So how does it do this? So the system does get a feed from an oracle as to what is the value of DAI relative to the dollar. And two things that there's two primary ways of stabilizing this coin. One is called a stability fee, and that's really a weird fancy term for an interest rate. When you are going and borrowing funds from the Maker smart contract, you're depositing ETH and you're getting DAI, but there's an interest that you're going to pay, meaning your ETH effectively will start to bleed, or you'll have to pay back more DAI into the system in order for you to kind of close your loan. So that interest rate, called the stability fee, goes up and down depending on whether or not DAI is worth more or less than the dollar. So if DAI is worth way more than the dollar, what we have now is we have a high demand for DAI, right? It's worth way more than the dollar for whatever reason, or even a small amount more than the dollar. So what the system wants to do is it wants people to generate more DAI and flood the market with DAI, because generally speaking, supply and demand would cause that to it will cause DAI to go down in value. So stability fee going down, which means interest rate goes down, means more people will want to borrow DAI in exchange for their ETH. So they'll put ETH in the system and borrow more DAI, and DAI will flood the market, causing the price in theory to drop. So the stability fee or the interest rate is one of the main ways that the system tries to regulate the value of DAI versus the dollar. And then there's a second way called the savings rate. So people with DAI can actually stake it and earn interest. And this is not unlike what we do in the regular financial system. You take your dollars, you put them in a bank account, and you get some interest. So obviously, if you do that, you have to stake it, you're locking up DAI, you're taking DAI out of float from the system, thereby increasing the demand. So increasing the savings rate or increasing the interest that you gain when you stake DAI pulls it off the market and also increases the demand for DAI. So if DAI were to drop below the value of the dollar, an increase in savings rate could potentially make up for it. Although that does also add more DAI into the system. So there's a bit of a back and forth there, but the net effect is believed in financial economic models. The net effect of people wanting to lock up their money should, generally speaking, cause DAI to go up relative to the dollar, especially if the interest is higher than what you would get in a regular bank account. Because if DAI is competing with a dollar, where else do you put your dollar? You put it in a regular bank account. It's only earning at this point
interest right now.
They're getting any interest right now, if not negative interest. If they're going to give you 1%, 2%, 3% interest in this other system, well, then people will want DAI versus wanting the dollar. So those are the two primary mechanisms by which DAI is kind of stabilized against the dollar.
It's funny because we've talked a lot about different DeFi projects on the show before, and I'm so used to the idea that when you lock up collateral, you get paid interest, because it's the idea is you're providing ETH for the system and therefore you get money in return. And so when I heard about the stability fee, I was like, wait, this is the opposite of this. You're paying money for the privilege of putting in the Ether into the system. So I had to kind of get my head around that. And that's when I learned about, this interest side. So they actually work in proportion to each other. And it's very interesting balance there of incentives. If they want to incentivize more people to have DAI, well, then they'll just increase the savings fee so that more people will want DAI, so they can save. If they want less DAI because the peg is too, if it's gone above $1, they decrease the savings fee and they increase the what's it called?
The interest rate.
Stability. Yeah, interest rate.
Stability fee, they call it.
Exactly.
Yep.
So it's this wonderful little interplay. And I think that's what's fascinating about a lot of these crypto projects is a lot of it is game theory. A lot of it is incentivization and trying to figure out, well, it's not just tech. How do we incentivize people to behave in a certain way? And DAI is for the most part, I mean, it's a really good peg. I think it lost its peg in March or something this year. But other than that, like it's pretty stable coin.
It's a pretty stable coin. Stable to what it's trying to be stable against. And that's one thing to always remember: a stable coin is only stable to against a specific asset, which in my eyes is not that stable, the dollar, blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, it's stable against the dollar. It's done quite well. I think it's lost, like you mentioned, it's lost its peg, but it's regained it. Unlike some other attempts at stable coins, just as a reminder, this is not the first stable coin to exist in the market. One of the early projects by Dan Larimer, BitShares, did BitUSD, and that lost its peg quite a while ago. And then also another project we covered, Hive, which was Steemit, had a USD coin as well, and it lost its peg, but in the upward trajectory, meaning it got worth way more than the dollar, which that might sound great and all, but it actually is really bad if you're trying to build financial products that are built on top of that coin. Whereas DAI has been, to my knowledge, someone please go ahead and comment in the chat whether or not I'm wrong about this, but I believe it's the first stable coin that's not directly backed by dollars. So it's I call it algorithmically stable, that actually has held its peg.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And there's a lot more complexity in there, especially because they added new ways to collateralize. It's not just Ethereum anymore. It's a bunch of things on the Ethereum blockchain. So all kinds of tokens you can use as collateral now. And And I think that it's important to maybe talk about those mechanisms, because when you talk about the stability fee and all of this, obviously the amount of collateral that you use. I mean, do we talk about over collateralization? So maybe we mention that, and then we'll talk about the differences in how much you need to actually collateralize depending on the asset, because the risks are very, very different there. You know, it's a lot more risky to put in some smaller coin, smaller token than to put in Ether. So walk us through so the idea of over collateralization and the differences across the board.
Yeah, so there's two challenges that Maker has. Number one, keeping DAI stable, right? And it does that through the two mechanisms that I mentioned, to keep stable through the savings rate and the stability fee. But it has a second challenge, which is how do we actually make sure there's enough collateral of funds in the system or on the smart contract to back the DAI, meaning that the DAI, the dollar amount of collateral exceeds the amount of DAI in the ecosystem. That's another challenge, independent of the value of DAI. That does directly affect it. If suddenly everybody in the world knew that, hey, you know, the amount of collateral is less than the amount of DAI in the system, people would want to sell off the DAI. So the mechanisms there are, number one, first, over collateralization. So that the rough over collateralization that's necessary for you to take out a loan is about 66%, depending how you view it. Meaning that if you were to put in $150 worth of Ether into the system, you can take out about $100 worth of DAI. So that's the loan. And then you now have an interest on that loan that you would have to pay. So that's one aspect of, you know, making sure that there's enough collateral. But now what happens, what were to actually happen if the collateral were to drop in Ether, as an example, were to drop in value, that $100 or $150 that you put in starts dropping and starts becoming worth about $100. You know, that you start to get to a danger point. And here's where the Maker smart contract can actually start to liquidate. It can actually start liquidating the collateral, and it puts it up for auction for people to buy the collateral and put in DAI into the system to buy the collateral from the smart contract. But it also has this emergency, like, oh my gosh, we're really getting low. We're really getting low to this $100 amount. If in this example of $150 of collateral coming down to that $100, in this sense, it actually starts to mint additional Maker. All right, so it actually creates more Maker, because Maker is a completely separate asset. Maker is not ever used to collateralize DAI. So it's a complete separate independent asset. It starts to mint more Maker, which it can then sell into the ecosystem to put more collateral to back the DAI that's in the system. So it's kind of like, and
that collateral has to be purchased for ETH, right? In that scenario?
The collateral in the early days, in my understanding, it needed to be definitely purchased with ETH, because ETH was the only collateral. I don't know if in now the multi-collateral DAI, whether or not it could just be purchased with any of the collateral that is accepted as use. So BAT being one of the first collateral tokens other than ETH to be accepted. Now there's a few others. So that I don't know whether it has to be ETH, but I presume it at least has to be one of the collaterals that are accepted.
Right, but I guess I should be more clear. So it can't be purchased using DAI, for example. So the idea is to put more ETH into the system because it's lost value. So you need to bump up the amount of collateral, the value that's there. Right.
I don't imagine it would be purchasable using DAI. But I could be wrong. That's not a detail I specifically know, but definitely ETH, BAT, and the other collaterals. Case. Yeah, that would make most sense.
It's like, it's interesting that auction system is actually incredibly complicated when you first look at it, but it makes a lot of sense when you explain it like that. The idea that your value is going lower because the value of ETH is going down. So you print off a bunch of Maker, and then you sell it for ETH, and the ETH goes back in and bumps up this collateral. But then they do this reverse auction thing. So can you explain can you explain what happens there? Because I mean, the idea is that, let's say I had $150 worth of Ethereum, and then I got out $100 worth of DAI, and then the value of my Ether starts to go down. And so I get liquidated. You want to make sure, like, there's as a person who's taking out the loan, you want to keep an eye on that loan and make sure you never drop below the amount of collateral needed. Otherwise, you will get liquidated. So what happens there? Your entire position doesn't necessarily get liquidated. It's like this interesting. Yeah. So explain that process there.
Yeah. So as you start getting closer to that collateralization ratio of well, you start off at 66%. Now these numbers, by the way, are variable, right? They can change based on the governance of Maker with people that hold Maker tokens. So the starting, and once again, I'm going to pull some numbers from some reference points that I had seen, but that 66% is what you kind of start off with. Like you'll get $100 for the 150. Now, as the $150 of Ether starts to trickle down and trickle down and trickle down and hit some, thresholds, what will happen is your Ether that you had backing the system will start to get sold off, right, and auctioned off to people to get more collateral, right, into the system, and you effectively get liquidated. At some point, yes, you get fully liquidated, right? That might actually happen. You get fully liquidated, but before then, it just starts selling off and selling off and selling off and selling off and selling off up until that point, out through an auction to get more money into the system. And that's really and that's actually what happens in normal lending markets as well. If you're to go and take out a loan using Compound, Aave, and any of the other DeFi products outside of Maker, the same thing will happen to you. Only difference is they don't have a stable coin that they're trying to stabilize and assets that are trying to back a specific stable coin. Instead of a smart contract being on the other side that's saying, oh my God, I don't have enough collateral, there's someone on the other side that's actually giving you money for the loan. And they're trying to make sure that that person stays whole. So Maker is not unlike a lot of the DeFi projects that are effectively money markets. One side is giving a loan, another side is taking a loan, except that here there's not two people, not a person on one side and another person on another side. Instead, it's a smart contract on one side and a person on the other. And that smart contract is saying, hey, I gave you some money in exchange for some collateral, but your collateral is now worth less. So I'm going to have to start liquidating it to make sure that I'm still whole. And I'll liquidate a little bit over time, and that I sell off. But at some point I have to liquidate you completely, and then your loan is still whole, but there's no longer a position, right? You don't owe me anything. I don't owe you anything at that point.
And I think that's when you're talking about these markets. So these are called automatic market makers, and there are lots of them out there at the moment. They're super interesting smart contract platforms. And
we can cover the white balancer.
Absolutely. I definitely want to look at that. Let us know if you have a preference about what to look at next. But it's interesting that when you have normal markets, because you're looking for someone else on the other side, there's slippage there. There's, a bid-ask spread. There's a difference between the amount that you would buy and sell. But these automatic market makers, the idea is not to have that slippage. So it's generally this, price point, and that's it, which is very interesting and a little bit different to what we've experienced in the past.
No, that's a complex study of financial models and financial engineering. That's an interesting topic to talk about on another day. It's one that's been argued and doesn't have a correct and right answer. It's just curves of, if the demand is here and we have this much supply, what should we sell it at? And that's really all a lot of these automatic market makers are doing, saying, well, supply versus demand, let's determine a price. And once again, there's no correct answer to that, but there's answers that have worked over time. So that being a separate discussion, probably when we talk about projects like Curve and Balancer, would be a great time to talk about some of those from the viewpoint of the collateralization and also the over collateralization, and also what happens when people take out loans. We forgot to mention that when people do take out these loans, they do have to pay fees, right? So there's a fee for some of these loans, and they're paid in Maker. That actually goes into a buffer. So the amount of interest that you pay on the loan doesn't directly go to somebody else, right? Not all of it. It starts to go first into a buffer, and that buffer is used also to back the collateral in emergency situations before minting of additional Maker. So the minting of additional Maker is kind of like the collateralization of last resort. But before that, it could start to liquidate some of this buffer, to take it from the buffer and put it into the collateral. However, if the buffer goes above a specific threshold, and that threshold is also set by the governance of people that hold Maker. If that buffer of fees that have been collected over time starts to go above a threshold, what happens is it'll actually take that Maker and burn it, and making it such that the Maker that people have becomes a little bit more valuable. And that's been debated by a few posts that I've seen saying, hey, should we burn the Maker? Should we do something else with it? But yeah, that's one case where you actually see the amount of Maker in the system go down. And so going back to the tokenomics of Maker, 1 million Maker tokens is how many existed from the very beginning. But you'll notice the liquid supply right now is a little bit less than 1 million. And that's because of this burning mechanism when the buffer starts to actually exceed the amount that they feel is necessary. So that means that the system is healthy. People are actually participating and paying the fees just fine. We also have enough collateral. So there has to be enough collateral. We have to be over collateralized. We don't need as much in this buffer. So we effectively start to burn it off. It'll actually sell the assets for Maker. I forgot to mention this. It actually sells assets for Maker and then burns the Maker that was paid to buy the assets inside of the buffer. So that's one mechanism we kind of didn't mention, which goes into the whole tokenomics of the Maker token itself.
So talking about the tokenomics there, because that's interesting. I'm not sure that whether this is a different point to the interest paid to Maker holders, or whether this is the same point, that it just makes their Maker token more valuable. I did an interview with Nick Kunkel. He's a dev for MakerDAO, and this is a members only video exclusive. So if you guys want to watch an in-depth dive with him, I ask a lot of dumb questions. He answers them very patiently. Really goes into how all this works. So if you want to check that out, head to nimibrockwell.com/memberships and you can watch that. Otherwise, it will be released eventually on my podcast as well. But he explained this as after you get a surplus in the buffer, it's actually paid as fees to Maker holders. So I'm not sure whether he meant as fees because the value of Maker goes up for those holders, or whether it's actually paid out in fees. Do you know?
So what my understanding was, a part of the fees that are paid from the stability fee, and please, anyone correct us if we're wrong here, but part of the fees paid from the stability fee go to the Maker holders, but part of it goes into the buffer. And when the buffer exceeds a certain threshold of fees collected, it sells off the assets that are in the buffer, because fees can also be paid in other assets, not just Maker. They can be paid in DAI. It sells that off for Maker, and then it burns the Maker. So whatever people paid with Maker to buy the assets in the buffer, the excess assets in the buffer, the Maker that's paid is then burned, hence reducing the supply of Maker. So the interesting game theory behind this is, if you're a holder of Maker, you control the governance of this protocol, and you want people to actually care about the governance of the protocol. Well, if you mess up, and if you cause and create variables in the system, such as the interest rates, stability fees, that cause the system to go to operate poorly, it may cause your Maker to get inflated, such as if there's not enough collateral in the system and more Maker needs to be printed. You're basically inflating yourself because you haven't properly governed the system. If you do properly govern the system and things are healthy and there's enough collateral, then Maker will eventually get burned, thereby making the Maker that you have actually more valuable. So this is part of the incentive model for people that to hold Maker, not just to hold it because they think it's going to trade really well on the exchanges, but also to go and govern it properly to help the Maker go up in value through the burning process. So that's I think an interesting game theory that I hadn't quite seen as much in other DeFi projects.
And also,
yeah,
it's
I like
nice.
what I see there.
Yeah, it's nice to see an incentive for people participating in governance, because quite often, like with comp, for example, did something happen, Paul? Seem
to have lost audio
happen
here.
Oh,
there we go. I can hear you now.
You can hear me? I wonder whose error that was on. I was just, we'll find out. I was just saying that it's interesting to see that incentive model for people to actually participate in governance. Because, for example, when we looked at Compound, and it's a very interesting system, but at the end of the day, there wasn't an incentive for people to, buy comp token itself, because you're not getting paid dividends. You're not, it was like, why would I participate? Why would I take the time to participate in governance? But Maker actually does have that incentive. You get paid fees. The stability fees, as you said, part of that goes to Maker holders. And when the system does well, then the Maker value goes up. So it's all kind of tied together in this very interesting way. And these projects all do things slightly differently. There are subtle differences. And I love seeing that competition, all these experimentations of how to make these systems work. It's very cool to watch. So that was something that was key for me, to see that incentive and to see Maker actually having, like, you can actually make money on Maker, or if you have DAI, you can actually make money from your DAI. Exactly. If you participate.
Just holding Maker, you don't get the fees. You actually have to participate and vote, and then you are privy to the fees collected from people taking out loans, for sure.
For sure. So do you want to walk me through, like, do you have other things that you want to add, or do we want to go to like a wrap up?
Oh,
Because there's lots to cover, but we just
there's a
kind of have
lot.
limited
Lending,
time.
other than the fact that, it is clearly one of the original and highest value projects. It's got over 2 billion locked,
Yeah.
like $2 billion of assets locked. And we had mentioned Ether being one of the collaterals, has multiple collateralization coins available now, BAT being the first one. I can't remember the other ones that are in the system now. And it's also like they say DeFi is like building blocks, Lego building blocks. It is at the base level of building blocks for almost every other DeFi project. So
Yeah.
can one come around and replace it? That's probably an interesting thing to say, to analyze. Are there possible replacements for Maker and DAI? And that's not a no, that definitely are. So Synthetics is one project that creates a stable coin as well, an SUSD, and it uses other mechanisms. It actually uses its own token as collateral for all of its synthetic assets. So that is one that is starting to gain traction. It has
You've
the
also got
potential
other
to achieve.
chains. I mean, I
There are
don't
other
think we
chains
can
as well.
discount things on other chains because gas fees are super high right now. So
Exactly.
Ethereum, like until they figure out scaling, they might run into some issues there. So you've got people on EOS trying to figure out a very similar system that it's cheaper for people to buy and sell.
Rootstock
And like
Bitcoin,
Tezos is kind of looking into this DeFi world at the moment as well.
I think the
There
challenge
are
for
different
all of
things
them,
popping up.
yeah, the challenge for all of them that Maker has going for it is based on Ethereum, and Ethereum has the biggest amount of liquidity, like the coin of itself. Ethereum has a lot of value. The tokens that are on Ethereum also carry a lot of dollar-based value, and having a lot of liquidity to back a stable coin is really important.
Yeah,
That's what they gain over being on other on other chains such as EOS, Tezos, and whatnot. Now, another chain that has potentially a lot of liquidity are ones based on Bitcoin. So I am starting to look at projects on Rootstock, such as Money on Chain, and others that are doing similar things, but not just copy pasting, not just taking like Maker, copy paste the code onto Rootstock, which is a smart contract blockchain just based on Bitcoin, but instead actually changing the incentive models and not using a lending or a loan model to create the stability of a coin, but using other mechanisms. So those are ones that I think have also a good chance to not only displace, but complement and pull some attention off, because Bitcoin is probably the only other chain outside of Ethereum that could displace itself, because it obviously has a ton of liquidity and a lot of users on it. So
And
that's
it is
probably the only
interesting. I
thing.
think that Bitcoin Cash is kind of looking into this world now as well. The SLP tokenization, they've got a lot of fun things going on there. But I do know that there are some people trying to dig into this DeFi world and seeing what they can put on.
They are.
Yeah. So we'll have to see what happens there. All right, Paul, do you want to take it away? Summary, give us your take. Is this
first?
Yeah, because you're the guy who talks about the things, Paul. So give us your rundown. Basically, the real question here is Maker worthwhile enough that you're willing to put in $100 into this?
Okay, I'm gonna give the answer, the two Paul answer. There's two different Pauls in this world, right?
Oh,
the guy who right now is running
cheating.
Edge.
That's cheating.
Well, yeah, but it depends on what kind of person are you, right? So it's good. I'm person running Edge, doing this podcast with Naomi once a week, and I'm a founder, pretty busy, of a startup. I don't have the time to really take my Maker and use it and actually participate in the ecosystem. That Paul is probably going to say no right now. I'm going to say no, because I actually want the benefit of being a participant. And I think that's where you'll gain most, right? I can make sure that the system is whole, that it's healthy, and gain from the burning and collection of fees. The Paul that, came maybe before starting Edge, or maybe after this is all said and done, maybe sell the company, whatnot. Yes, would buy Maker, but not just buy it, but actually participate with it. So that's kind of my take on it. And right now I do run Edge, so my answer would be effectively no. But for all those people listening and have a bit more time to actually participate in the ecosystem, I would say yes. Then it would be a great token to not just buy, hold, and invest in, but also to participate with, because I think that's the most important part and where you have the most to gain.
I think this is the first week where we're going to disagree, Paul.
All right.
We finally reached a week. I'm the same as Edge, Paul. I'm not going to participate in the voting and all of that.
You're busy too.
I'm really busy. But that being said, I look at the underpinning of this DeFi world. It really is this maker project. I think we can't understate how important it's been in building out this DeFi movement. So even based on that, I think that maker is very interesting, and being so important as central part of the movement. Yeah, I'll buy $100 on it and see what happens to it. So there you go. Our first disagreement. Our first disagreement. We're going to have to look into our portfolios one day, Paul, and show people where we're at. I'm a little scared.
I know.
All right, everyone.
Yep, we'll do it.
For sure. Everyone who's been watching, thank you so much. As I mentioned, I did do an interview with Nick Kunkel, who is a dev for MakerDAO, and super interesting interview. He explained a lot of the intricacies. Obviously, we have limited time here, so if you wanted like an hour-long deep dive into this, then head over to naomibrockwell.com/memberships. You could check out the interview there. Otherwise, in a few weeks, it will also be launched on my podcast. You can check that out. But thank you all for joining us. This has been super fun, and we'll let you know what we're covering next week. Do you remember what it is, Paul?
Next week, I do not remember, unfortunately.
So it's going to be a surprise. It's going to be a surprise, everyone. Absolutely. Lots of exciting things going on. You never know what you're going to get. Kieran is late, but it's good to see you finally, Kieran. But I'll chat to you all later, and go enjoy your day. If you haven't checked out CoinTree, just a plug there. Go check it out. You can support content creators of your choice. If you haven't checked out Edge Wallet, go check that out too. Awesome multi-coin wallet.
Edge.app.
Have a great day, everyone.
Hey, everybody.